In April of 2022, the Minister of Canadian Heritage tabled Bill C-18, the Online News Act, in Parliament. It's worked its way through the House of Commons and is now in first reading in the Senate. I think it's one of the worst examples of bad public policy in the technology space. It essentially uses pretend market and bargaining mechanisms to legally extort money from successful technology companies in order to prop up failing news businesses. Before I get into the meat of this, I should be 100% clear. I think a healthy and vibrant news industry is essential to our society and our democracy. I think it should be supported financially. It should be from the public purse, however, and not by selecting a group of successful companies and saying, we don't like them, so we'll raid their coffers. This sets a terrible precedent. Hi, my name is David Fraser. I'm a privacy, internet, and technology lawyer with the Canadian law firm McGuinness Cooper. I also teach internet and media law at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. In this channel, I try to provide educational and informative content about Canadian privacy and technology law. You should check out the full disclaimer below, but you should also know that I'm about to give you a very high-level overview of a nuanced subject, and there are a number of aspects of this bill that I'm not going to be able to get to in any detail. I should also be clear that I've done legal work for media companies, and I do legal work for companies who are the targets of this bill. This is only my opinion and should not be attributed to my firm or any of its clients. And nobody's paying me to say this. In my view, this bill is founded on a completely false premise. Newspapers are seeing revenues dropping, while large tech companies are seen as having an outsized role in advertising in Canada. At the same time, some of these large tech companies have become conduits through which links to online news are being distributed, either through search results or through sharing on social media. Also, the traditional audiences for news have gone elsewhere. So before the internet, news was scarce. You'd have your local newspaper and your local news broadcast. Now news is everywhere and it's free. You can go through life in Canada in 2022 or 2023, be completely well informed and not pay a cent out of your pocket for the news you receive. That news costs money to produce. It costs a lot of money. And it's really in the public interest that Canadians receive high quality news. I should note that I pay to support and subscribe to multiple newspapers and online news sources, but I understand that I'm in the minority. It used to be that news was largely paid for by advertising. Local news had a virtual monopoly on local advertising. If you wanted to see what was on sale at your local grocery, you'd buy the local newspaper. If you were looking for a job, you'd buy the local newspaper and turn to the Help Wanted ads. Sometimes the ads were the inducement to actually buy the newspaper. Also, before the internet, if a company wanted to get its ads in front of an audience, local news was top of the list. Local news was the most attractive place to advertise. Local news essentially had a monopoly on certain kinds of advertising. A significant amount of page space was taken up by ads. You have classifieds, want ads, obituaries, and birth announcements. Local news charged a premium for those, and that paid for their news gathering. Classifieds have since been replaced by free alternatives like Kijiji and Craigslist. Funeral homes do online obituaries, even better than newspapers ever could. Birth announcements have been replaced by social media posts by new parents. For news media, their large audiences went elsewhere as they lost their monopoly on informing the public, and their advertisers followed the audience. If I'm a retailer and I want to show my ads to a specific audience, digital advertising is much more effective for that. Imagine you run a skateboarding shop. If you advertise in a newspaper or during the evening news, you're paying to put your ad in front of an audience that likely does not resemble the people who would go to your store. That ad is worthless to 90% of the eyeballs that see it. With online advertising, you can target that ad to young people in a specific area. Even better, you can place it on a website about skateboarding, or you can target someone who has a demonstrated interest in skateboarding. So now the news media want to recapture the money they think they're entitled to. It's 100% true that good news reporting costs money, and good news reporting is clearly a social good. They want two companies in particular to pay Canadian news media, Facebook, now called Meta, and Google. The rhetoric is they're stealing our content or are profiting off their content. Now, the news media used to have a stranglehold on analog advertising, making a lot of money. Now Google and Meta are leaders in the digital advertising ecosystem, making a lot of money. This problem isn't unique to Canada, and a very powerful media empire from Australia managed to get the government there to come up with a scheme of mandatory bargaining to address the alleged inequality of bargaining power to give back to the media the alleged value that the platforms take from them. Personally, I think this is a farce. The government says that this bill is to ensure, quote, fair revenue sharing between digital platforms and news outlets, unquote. Fair revenue sharing? Like revenue from what? What are they bargaining for? It has nothing to do with the underlying issue. The media get much more of a benefit from having their links shared by the platforms than the platforms get by hosting those links. Most of the online links to news that I click on are put there for free by the media outlets themselves. The media can actually control whether their site is indexed by Google, and most of them include specific tools to encourage you to share the story by social media. So what is being paid for? There's no copyright or any other sort of property in links. Even the snippets are fair dealing under copyright law. The government is simply making up a new legal regime to fund news media on the backs of big companies. And this sets a horrible precedent of having successful, innovative businesses subsidize the businesses that have been eclipsed by progress. Will solar panel makers have to subsidize oil companies? So what does this bill do? Essentially, it requires the platforms, or digital news intermediaries as they're called, to negotiate with the media to compensate them for something they're really not entitled to compensation for. And if an agreement is not negotiated, there's a cumbersome process of arbitration that will impose a payment schedule on them. And it's all overseen by the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission. Now, the government says repeatedly that it's not a link tax, but that is essentially what it is. An organization is a digital news intermediary if they make news content available to persons in Canada. And making news content available can mean just providing links to it. There are other huge problems with the bill. It will mean that the online platforms cannot discriminate against news companies, even on the basis of quality. They'll have to rank misinformation alongside quality journalism. Bill C-18 includes language barring platforms from acting in any way that unjustly discriminates against a publisher, gives undue or unreasonable preference to any individual or entity, or subjects the business to an undue or unreasonable disadvantage. There are so-called news media in Canada that would fit the definition of an eligible news business. These businesses have been actively pushing misinformation related to the pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and protests in Canada. One in particular really likes to frame itself as a victim of all sorts of oppression, including being downgraded by social media platforms. They will be at the front of the line complaining to the CRTC. And the natural result is that this low-quality so-called news will have to be equally prominent to credible news outlets. It also means that money will go to non-Canadian companies that hardly contribute to the news ecosystem here. It's also very likely that the handful of new media startups that have innovated in the industry will also get left behind, while the incumbents reap most of the lucre. It is just really, really bad public policy, and I'm not optimistic that the Senate will be able to fix it, as the government seems hell-bent to stick it to big tech. But if anyone is listening, I think this whole thing should be scrapped and a new scheme should be established to provide public funding for quality news in Canada. There's already a Canadian Journalism Labour Tax Credit with an independent advisory board on eligibility for journalism tax measures. This should be expanded to cover not just employees but also freelancers. It should also be expanded to cover other non-labor expenses associated with creating quality journalism. If journalism is a public good, it should be publicly funded. We should not set a precedent where failed business models are propped up by those who are successful. I hope this has been interesting and useful. I try to put out a new video each week or so if you're interested in this sort of content, please click the like and subscribe buttons. Also, leave a comment if you have any questions or if you have any suggestions for other topics to cover. And of course, feel free to share this with anyone who you think may be interested in hearing about developments in Canadian tech and privacy law. Thanks for tuning in.